Hello and welcome to Miscellaneous Musings, my informal, mostly unedited pseudo-podcast where I ramble about narrative mediums for as long as I like, sometimes with guests, and always released a week early for my Patreon supporters. Today on Miss Muse, we're talking about narrative junk food, how we engage with it, and why it's important to consider beyond a simple on-the-face dismissal. Domestic Kanojo, or Dome Kano, is one of the currently airing anime for the season of Winter 2019, and was kind of the impetus behind this topic, why I started thinking about narrative junk food, and why I wanted to figure out what kind of things can we take away from it, and I should actually probably define narrative junk food before I go into all of my examples that I've been thinking about, and the value and what we can learn about ourselves and our viewership. In the fact that we continue to engage with these shows, despite the fact that, so narrative junk food, if I had to define as simply as possible, would be shows without thematic depth. And what I mean by that is stories that have all of their meaning directly on the surface, and there's not a lot to chew on beyond just what it immediately gives you on the face. A good example of this from live action would be most reality television, like Real Housewives and all of its spin-offs, and half a dozen other shows of the exact same structure, which are just drama fests, and that's what they're trying to convey, and that's how they're trying to convey it, just through screaming and arguing, and it's trying to appeal to a emotional desire for drama and train wrecks, to watch train wrecks happen in slow motion. And part of that is just the function of reality television as a mostly unscripted, and let's not pretend that Real Housewives and a lot of other reality television isn't very much propagated by producers, because that's their job in this in this kind of genre. But compared to something like Mad Men, which is also very interpersonal, or Breaking Bad, which is also very interpersonal. We're talking about interpersonal relationships and the depth that you can acquire through proper scripting in those kind of genres is a lot deeper. There's a lot more to chew on there, but it's not things that are scripted need to have it's not things that are unscripted can't have that thematic depth. I can think to a bunch of documentaries where it's very clear that the director and the editor sat down at the end of shooting all of the footage, probably went in with a little bit of the story they wanted to tell, and then at the end we're okay, how do we construct the narrative such that it really follows through on this big thematic idea. And that's how you can acquire depth in that way too. But it's just completely, a documentary is going for a completely different market, I guess, than reality television. And I say this as someone who doesn't really watch reality TV because the kind of emotions it's trying to incite, I think, are not ones that I'm particularly fond of engaging with in these kind of things. I don't enjoy drama in my life. It's so friggin' exhausting. I don't need more of it. This isn't to say that I object to narrative junk food on the face. As I said at the top, I think there's a lot to learn from narrative junk food and the various different types of narrative junk food. And for me, that's the most important thing. When I engage with narrative, I'm always trying to learn something. Whether it's a book or a movie or a video game, usually one that is, story focused, something like Uncharted compared to a multiplayer game like Apex Legends. It's not really a strong narrative there outside of the narrative that you craft for yourself by playing the game, which is interesting in and of itself. I really would love to talk about player-driven narrative within multiplayer games. That might actually be a sneak peek at the next topic for 2 weeks from now, but for another time. The reason why I interact with those mediums that I was just talking about, books, movies, video games, is because I want to understand narrative and mediums better. I want to understand what certain mediums offer that others don't, what kind of stories are best told on, let's say, a stage, or what stories are best told through words on a page compared to what we can see or what we can hear. And I also am interested in storytelling, the mechanics of storytelling, the subversion of certain mechanics, the subversion of tropes, how tropes work, how we can build tension, how we can set up expectations. Basically, everything I've been exploring on Replay Value for God knows how long now, over a year. That's crazy to think about. But this is why I'm interested in narrative, because I want to grow. I want to understand storytelling better, because storytelling is so important to me, not only as a writer, as an artist, as a creator, and as an audience member, but also just to like me as a person. The way that I view my life is through storytelling. It's almost impossible. I imagine that's true for most of you too, that like we view our lives through stories in a lot of ways. And for me, literally everything is storytelling. So it's really important to me that I understand not only how storytelling works in nonfiction, but how storytelling works in fiction, and because I feel like I can learn things about my life through stories. This is the way that we pass information to one another. So to try and tie this back into narrative junk food, I think that there is value in exploring stories that are not masterpieces. So certainly I learned a lot about film from watching a movie like The Godfather, and I learned a lot about it from watching a movie like Vertigo. And I didn't learn nearly as much from watching a movie like The Room, but The Room also provided a lot of information on what not to do, and how, even if you have great production values, like how dialogue needs to be constructed and how stringing together scenes should work in a certain way. Like, I don't feel like you will learn as much. Let's say theoretically someone learns how to read and then they don't read any books until they suddenly sit down and they read insert like pinnacle of literary achievement here, Tale of Two Cities, something, Catcher in the Rye. Pick your favorite like highfalutin book. If someone tries to read that and really like try and figure out what makes a great book out of that, they're going to run into a bunch of pitfalls, because a what to do list is not the same as a what not to do list. And you kind of need to go through what not to do in order to be able to understand what works. And what I like about narrative junk food is that usually there's just like the one element that really like makes you stick to it. So I think of like James Patterson novels. I would not say that James Patterson is like the greatest author of the 21st century. I feel like his books are very surface level in terms of like depth, but I really enjoy Patterson books because I can sit down and read the entire thing in one day, because I'm really interested in like the way that the story is written is very engaging, and the pace is always moving forward, and we're stacking tension, and the characters are like, for the most part, I'm generalizing very heavily here. And I'm mostly referring to like the Alex Cross books, the Private series. Those are the ones that like I'm thinking of when I say this, compared to something like Maximum Ride, which I guess I haven't read since I was a teenager. So it hasn't been that long, but it's been a hot minute. But so there's something to be learned in like how can we write a really engaging storyline that doesn't actually require that much like deep thought process. The same thing is true with someone like Dan Brown, and although I would say that Dan Brown's stories are a little bit heavier and his plot twists are interesting, I remember reading Inferno and being like, oh my God, this plot twist is amazing, because I was so expecting, the generic plot twist of the Da Vinci Code and what was the one before that? It was set in Washington, D.C. I can't remember the name right now. Was it? Oh no, Origin's the one that he just released, which I haven't read yet. But anyway, sorry. So what I think is interesting about narrative junk food is how like you can basically just isolate what about this thing like works and why, like, what about that is engaging and is like dragging you through what would otherwise not be a particularly enjoyable experience. Like, I don't really enjoy simple characters. I don't really enjoy, like, I don't. I tend not to enjoy things that are like, I would argue, too quickly paced. I would argue that Patterson struggles from a bit of that. I tend to enjoy slow burns, especially with thrillers. I really enjoy slow burns with thrillers, and that is not what happens in those books. But and sure, I can learn a lot more from reading in Agatha Christie, because those are just like structurally marvelous most of the time, not all of them. But those are a little bit, more thicker. Those are something that you really want to bite your teeth into and take your time and like try and solve the mystery beforehand. Whereas I feel no obligation to try and solve what's going to happen with Patterson, because it's usually like one of three things and I'm ready for any of those. I remember one time I was surprised by the ending. I was like, oh, this is great. And I was like, this is the best Patterson book I've read in a long time. And I can't even remember the title because it left that little of an impression on me, apparently. And that's the other thing about narrative junk food. I have read so many, like, just books that I have finished in a day and then put down and have never thought about again. Because there just wasn't that much to it. It got me through the day. It was an engaging story for the moment, but I didn't like sit back and be like, damn, that was so crazy, like I have with a book like Dune, which I love. I love Dune. I think Dune is a great book. Dune and Dune Messiah are phenomenal stories. Okay, so I think I've given like a good example. So now I think I've given a good explanation about why I think narrative junk food's important, why I think it's important to explore. So I wanted to like talk through some examples of like anime narrative junk food, because I don't feel like I need to explain why things that you can like chew on are important. Like a series like Hyoko, where you rewatch it like 4 times, and every time you see something different, or you understand a character a little bit differently. Like those stories where you really chew on them and ruminate on them, and they stick with you for days, weeks, months, maybe even years. These stories just attach to you, and you just can't let them go. They're just always there in the back of your mind, like ready to be like, oh, hey, did you think about this? Like, how cool was that when Princess Mononoke, like, how cool was it that Princess Mononoke handled this topic of Lady Eboshi versus the forest? Like, how brilliant was that? Like, how cool was it how they did all of the world building? I haven't seen this movie in 3 years. I still think about Mononoke all the goddamn time. I'm never going to get over that movie. Most of my favorites, every film, TV series, book, whatever, that I would consider like masterpiece level is probably never going to leave me. I will always be thinking about them, which is a like really crazy thought, but it's also nice because I know that I have like an infinite amount of space for great narratives to like care about. I'm not worried about like having to kick something out because, something else has come along. Like there is no limit to the number of masterpieces in the world. Anyway, enough about great things. Now I'm going to talk about things that are not great, maybe even mediocre and bad, but have like just really good, strong elements that like just that make you stick with these stories. And I feel obligated to start with Zome Kano. For those who do not know, it's a story about a high school guy who has a crush on his teacher, goes out one night, sleeps with a girl to try and get over the teacher, and then it turns out that both the teacher and the girl he just slept with are now his step-siblings. And this story is ridiculous. It is melodramatic, really great OP, and that's really the only praise I think I could give it after having watched the first episode and then having read the entire manga. And I read the first episode, but I've not read the first, watched the first episode because I was like, does this really happen? Like, there's no way this happens, right? And then I watched it, and then I read the entire manga. I actually think I watched the first 2 or 3 episodes, because I showed up to it a little bit late, and then I read the entire manga and over the course of 3 days. And you can't say like wanting to see what will happen. Like, yes, wanting to see what will happen is like a baseline point of interest, but that definitely isn't the reason why. Or, I mean, yes, it can be. And I think the thing that Dome Kano does really well is it sets up really strong cliffhangers, both in the anime and in the manga, that make you like just think, oh yeah, I can just read one more chapter. It's not that big of a deal. And then you get into what is the term? Sunken cost fallacy. And then you get sunken cost into it and you're like, yeah, I just want to know what happens, like completionist desire. Those things start to like come into effect. And I think these are definitely things that happen. There's no argument in my mind that these are elements. But I do think that I had felt similarly about Shokugeki no Soma, where I had spent so much time reading the manga and like really caring about the characters. And then I just straight up dropped it because the writing quality, in my opinion, just took a friggin' nosedive to the point where it wasn't really scratching any of the itches that I had in regard to the story. And I think, well, I can talk about Shokugeki some other time. Maybe I'll do a video on the downfall of Shokugeki, though. I've already made one video about Shokugeki no Soma, and it is probably the most hate I've ever gotten in a comment section besides Goblin Slayer, which let's not talk about either of those. So I think that you can only have, like, yes, the desire for completion up to a point, but if you take too much of a dive in quality and you're not like hitting the points that your audience wants from a series, they're going to leave. And I think Dome Kano hits just like a very well balance of like the stakes are constantly going up in interesting ways. Like the drama is kind of always changing and unfolding. I think it does a good job of like balancing narratives. I think Momo is the best character in the series in terms of like three-dimensionality. I think almost every other character is 2D. That's not outside of the principal three. But I think Momo weirdly was handled very properly, given that on first introduction, you would be like, oh, she's going to go, like, this is going to be handled in X way. And then I think it just like did a very good job of handling the character and like making the character feel real. I was legitimately impressed. Dome Kano sets out very simple goals for their characters to achieve. It gives incremental progress towards those things. It's almost like an idle game. Actually, now that I think about it, it's Dome Kano is like the idle game of anime, where it just sets up like small incremental goals, and then things will happen and the goals will shift, and then the audience is like, oh, I now wonder how those things are going to shift. How is this going to affect this thing that I care about, or this thing that I don't care about, or that, like, it basically lets you pick and choose. Like, do you care about Natsuo wanting to be an author? Great. Now's this thing that matters about that. And do you care about X character's desire to do X? Fantastic. I don't want to go into manga spoilers for somewhat obvious reasons. I want to let people watch the show and enjoy it if they're enjoying it, or not enjoy it if they're not enjoying it, because who cares? But I do think Dome Kano does these things very well. It sets up, it has a lot of plot threads. It shifts things all the goddamn time so that you're constantly wondering like what's going to happen in the background. It does a good job of escalating. And I do think that the three principal characters are all engaging in their own ways. I don't think the series is great, though. I really feel like it's very much like on the surface. I've seen some arguments made that like the character depth and relation depth are really interesting, but it's all very easy to follow along, and you can predict a lot of what's coming up. Not that these things are bad, but I feel like Dome Kano is not dealing with super deep themes, but it doesn't have to. Not all stories have to be like super deep. And I think Dome Kano succeeds in what it sets out to do, which is good, because that means that we can figure out why its elements work very well. And I just discussed a bit of that. So let's stick with the romance angle and talk about Nisekoi. And Nisekoi is a completed manga series which I've read in addition to watching the 2 seasons. Nisekoi was probably one of my first anime too. Now that I think about it, um, it's crazy. It's crazy how that happens. I'm not one for the waifu wars, guys. But Onodera was best girl, and oh man, and Nisekoi. I mean, for me, I think Nisekoi is a really bad story. Frankly, I really disliked it. Like the entire time I was reading the manga to catch up, I was just like, this is so boring. Who wins? I just want this to be over. But Nisekoi the anime has an amazing visual style, and that's the only reason why I watched the show for 2 seasons, even though season 2 is a bit of a downgrade, visually speaking, at least in my opinion. If I remember correctly, it has been a hot minute since I watched Nisekoi, or even thought about Nisekoi, because I don't think about junk food. But I do distinctly remember the visual direction and the colors of Nisekoi being frigging fantastic. And I just really couldn't care less about the romance plot because it's about as paint by numbers as it gets. Again, not really dealing with any like super deep themes. The manga, I guess, has like a theme at the end, but it's really weak because it just middles for so long. There's an endless status quo, which drives me nuts. I really hate that about a lot of rom-coms, specifically harems. They just spin their wheels for an eternity in place, and then all of a sudden they get threatened with cancellation or something, and then they rush to the finish line, which is what feels like happened in Nisekoi for sure, and why I love a story like Kaguya Wants to Be Confessed To, which has actual goddamn progress and like organic progress too. Kaguya is so good, or Quince, which is a little bit more on the Nisekoi side of things, but also I feel like has a very strong like pacing of development for all of the characters. Really, I'm going to talk about Quince probably this month. Yeah, I want to talk about Quince because this anime adaptation has me so goddamn bummed, dude. It just looks so ugly, and the art of Quince is like the best part of the show. So yeah, I'm just really frustrated about that. Well, but anyway, Nisekoi's visual style I think is really impressive. It's a great example of how like we can use abstract shots to convey meaning, and is a great example of how like using cartoony and colorful models like makes something more enjoyable to watch. Basically, it's very clear that the show is having fun, even while the characters are having fun, and so we as an audience should have fun too. I don't recommend Nisekoi at all, except for the first season, and then you should just read the Wikipedia article that tells you who wins at the end, because honestly, the manga is so boring, and I'm sure I really annoyed someone by saying that. I want no one here to take personal offense to any of the shows that I'm about to talk about or have already spoken about. I'm not attacking you personally. I just think that these shows, and if you like these shows, I think that's good because you can find out what's so appealing about them and interrogate that a little bit and really come to some like really interesting conclusions about what you like. And to completely jump to a different style of series, Akame ga Kill, I think, is a great example of junk food stories. Akame ga Kill, for those who do not know, is... How do I even begin I have not watched the show in so long. How do I even begin to describe Akame ga Kill? In a universe where like there are basically super weapons and only super weapons can beat super weapons, this kid goes to the capital. It's extremely corrupt. His friends die. He joins the resistance group, gains a super weapon. They fight. S-Death is in the show. It's very, very interesting. I think the storyline is really boring. The manga is not much better. I think I read it after it completed. I don't think the storyline is particularly engaging. I don't think the characters are particularly engaging, with basically the exception of title character Akame or Akane. No, it's Akame. But for me, I think the interesting element that kept me going, and I also didn't care about the death thing, like the idea that any character could die. I don't think that shouldn't be a reason why to watch a show. Like, any character that is in the show could die at any moment. Like, that's not a draw. The draw is, how do characters respond to death in the show? Like, how does that foster growth? And Akame ga Kill just like didn't do anything with it in most cases, at least in my opinion. At least not in like interesting ways. What I thought was interesting was the powers. Like, what I think Akame ga Kill does really well is it has really interesting weapons. Like the weapons that they use are very interesting. Like the powers, the way that they interact. There's a lot of applications, and I think that's the interesting part. At least for me, that was the only reason why I kept watching. The second that the show ended with basically all the items being destroyed, I was like, oh, okay, I don't care anymore. They didn't end with all of them destroyed. Just like most of the team died, and I was just like, I don't care. I don't really actually care about any of these deaths. Like, good riddance. You had no characters, but your weapons were cool, and that's kind of dope. And that's kind of where I came down on the series was, hey, like, cool implementation, like cool ideas, I think are always something that I'm willing to engage with. If an idea is cool, and I would say that not only were the ideas cool, but the execution of the ideas were also cool. Like the way that the weapons interacted in fights, I thought was very interesting and felt very cool. That was really the only reason why I watched the show. And I think that's true for a show like Seven Deadly Sins, like very similar. I was mostly interested in what powers the Sins had, and once that was over, I was interested in what the enemies had, and once that was over, I couldn't care less. And that's kind of where we are in the manga right now. I just don't really care at all about anything that's happening, and I've stopped reading it actually because I could not care less. Seven Deadly Sins is just another one of those, like, does it have like somewhat interesting ideas? Yes. Do those ideas like have interesting execution? Sure. It's not Hunter x Hunter, where I think Nen is like a brilliant way of framing power usage. But it's a little bit more interesting than power levels from Dragon Ball, or at least my impression. I've never actually seen Dragon Ball. I'm sure this is going to end super well for me. But yeah, I think like good idea. What I'm more interested in than like, is this idea good? Because a good idea will, like, I guess, get me in the door. Like, it's a premise. But then the execution on that idea, the execution on that premise is what gets me to stick around. And if you don't execute properly, I don't really care, even if the idea is like amazing. I think to something like Sword Art Online Season 1 Part 1, which has, like, I think the death game Aincrad is a good idea that was just really poorly executed on. And that's also a show that, like, it's weird because I wouldn't say that Sword Art Online is junk food, mostly because I think Season 1 is just like, maybe it is junk food because it's not good. Like, I would never say that Sword Art Online is good at all, and it completely betrays like the interesting premise it sets up. But like there are elements to it that like you can read into. There is a theme. I mean, everything has a theme technically, but I don't feel like it's surface level in its themes. Like, there is something that you can dig into a little bit. Yeah, Sword Art Online is weird. Like, Alicization is like kind of proof of this. Like, Alicization is like fine. Like, it's an acceptable show. It's like a blend of sci-fi and fantasy, and it's good. The story actually has legs. Like, it's going somewhere. We're at episode, I don't know, like 19, 18, something like that, and it shows no signs of stopping. Like, clearly we're going pretty far with it, as opposed to the Aincrad arc, which just like suddenly is like, oh yeah, 2-year time skip. Oh yeah, now it's over. Like, that's so weird. Like, that decision making just confuses the hell out of me for Sword Art Online. I realize I believe that Alicization was like the point of the series, and like the earlier elements were just to like set up for it, which is weird because those earlier elements are interesting ideas in their own right. I'm not going to get sidetracked with Sword Art Online. The point being is that like there is a theme to SAO. It's what happens in virtual worlds. That the real world and virtual worlds are indistinguishable in terms of like their effect on people, which makes complete sense. Like, as someone who uses the internet, like, relationships that I have with people online feel just as real as the ones that I have in real life. Like, these things make sense in my head. I just think that like the first season of Sword Art Online does a horrible job of executing on it, even though like a death game inside a video, like an MMO, is like the perfect place to explore like humanity and morality. Like, all of these things are so interesting, and you can clearly see that there are elements of that with oh god, what's the Killing Guild's name? Laughing Coffin? I feel like it's Laughing Coffin. There are clearly elements of that, but it just like does not execute even remotely well on the idea. Anyway, now I got completely sidetracked. I was talking about Seven Deadly Sins. So I think like like this idea of good ideas and like decent execution is like similar for something like Active Raid, which is a show that I would be shocked if you've heard of. It's like, I'm pretty sure I watched it because it is a mecha police procedural, and I like mecha as a genre, and I like police procedurals. And I thought the fights were somewhat engaging. Like, I think one of like the quintessential examples of narrative junk food is like quality combat, right? Like, just something where you can like shut your brain down, if you can do that, and just like watch things punch each other. Like, that's totally an element of junk food, or narrative junk food. Just like watching things fight and like good visual effects. And I think Active Raid, even though it has some like interesting CG, definitely follows through on that. I think that the narrative is well, it's absurd, frankly, but there is some interesting elements, and I think Active Raid, at least for me, is proof that if there is like funny characters, I will watch a show if I think the characters are funny in the way that they interact. And I think the characters in Active Raid are legitimately funny, and the plot is nonsensical, and that's fine because I wasn't really engaging with the plot or with like any of the characters really beyond just like their one note like element that made them funny. And I haven't thought about Active Raid in a long time. I don't remember any of the characters' names. It's really not a remarkable show. The second season is actually just like makes no sense, goes off the rails. But the fights are good. The visual effects are nice. I think the soundtrack was good too. I feel like it had a jazzy tune to it. Or maybe that was the ending. One of them. Something like that. But Active Raid is like very much this is the continuation of like, can you execute on your fight scenes? Great, you're good. Like, woo! Keijo is very similar to that in terms of like, does it have interesting ideas? Can it execute on it? Is it like visually flashy? Yes, great. Like, don't need to think about it too much. Like, makes sense to me. It's a tournament arc. Woohoo! Like, very like combat and like interesting ideas. Easy money. Prince of Stride, Keijo, Akame ga Kill, Seven Deadly Sins. All of these are like more or less in the exact same boat as far as I'm concerned. And then you get something like Prince of Stride. I'm burning through my list now. I wrote out like a small list of shows that like came to mind. Prince of Stride, I think, is actually, it has, okay. I think Prince of Stride is, again, like very surface level in what it's trying to execute on. It's a very visually like flashy show, very colorful. I think it's very inventive in some of its shot types. Prince of Stride is like basically parkour relay racing. That's the best way I can describe it. And it has a great visual style. It also has a great soundtrack, and it has a great sound design. So I think like from a production level, the show is very satisfying, even if like the characters are all, for the most part, except for the main two, really very one-dimensional. Which is fine. Like 1D character, like I keep saying one-dimensional characters like it's some kind of insult. Like no, shows need one-dimensional characters. You need them to like fill out and make sure that everything is working properly. Otherwise, like one-dimensional characters are important to highlight your other characters who maybe aren't one-dimensional. I would have liked more of the cast to be a little bit more fleshed out, though. But Prince of Stride has a bunch of narrative problems. The pacing is interesting. It's an interesting show. Maybe it's not narrative junk food. I should rewatch it. I haven't seen it in a while. It's been I watched it when it was airing, I think. I do remember waiting week to week. I don't remember liking the ending very much, which might be why I'm like, oh, it's narrative junk food. Maybe it's not. But one of the better examples, my closing example, is Excel World, also by the guy who made SAO, Reki Kawahara, I think, and made by Studio Sunrise. And Excel World has like it's similar to SAO. It's like an MMO set in. I think it's technically augmented reality, but with time slowed down. It's really interesting. And again, like, and it's a fighting game instead of like a traditional MMO where like you do combat, PvP as opposed to like PvE. And I don't think, is there a leveling up system? Man, I remember there is a leveling up system. No one's about to die though. And so I think the show's theme is that virtual worlds can be freeing for individuals. I'm relatively confident that that's the case because of the main character who develops wings in the show and keeps striving to like be better, be a better player, all of that good stuff. The plot line is really paint by numbers, in my opinion. The characters are really boring. The villain in the second half of the second half villain is actually probably the most interesting character, but he's just a turd. Like he's just like blatantly not a good person. Like there's not depth to him, even though he has like the most interesting character. I don't know. Everyone in the show is kind of just like pretty boring, pretty standard. I mean, that's not really surprising given the lineage from which it either spawned or what it in turn spawned, because I'm not sure what the order is in that case. But I mean, and I probably would not have watched the show if not for the fact that Sunrise did an amazing job with the visuals. That, again, the ideas are like interesting. Each of the characters has their own powers. The way that these powers can interact, I think these things are all engaging. It does a great job of using cliffhangers to end off arcs and scenes and episodes. In regard to all of this, I think Excel World's like the perfect example of junk food, because you can watch it and you'll be able to pick up on like all of the subtleties on your first go, because it's really not trying to be subtle at all. And like the characters are who they are, and there's not, and they grow in very, very obvious ways, often spoken out loud. But it is like a visually pleasing show to watch, and it has a great soundtrack. It's very like a lot of really strong electronic music. Silver Wing, I think I've used that song in one of my videos before, and that's a great track. And Chasing the World is an amazing OP. I really got to give credit where credit is due. Chasing the World is an amazing OP song, and like is perfect for this kind of show. But yeah, it's very on the face with what it's trying to achieve. you can watch it once, and if you're not like paying super close attention, you're not going to miss anything. I think that's the point, right? For this kind of discussion, for this kind of topic, for narrative junk food. It's shows that like are satisfying to watch, that but are not going to like really change the way that like you engage with maybe the medium or your life or these kind of things. And maybe that's setting the bar a little bit too high. But I haven't thought about Excel World or Active Raid or Prince of Stride or Seven Deadly Sins or any of the shows that I'm talking about. Even Dome Kano, which I finished like all of 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago. I haven't thought about it. Like I just do not care. Like the show has no staying power. And I think that's the fundamental definition is like, sure, yes, shows without narrative depth is like one way to describe it. But another way is show like stories without staying power, stories that like kind of just pass through you and you're consuming because they're there. And they have something that like does it for you. But the second that you put that one down, you can just move on to the next one. Whereas, you know, if you finish a show like Psycho-Pass, I'm going to pick Psycho-Pass. If you watch a show like Psycho-Pass and you finish that, you're going to have like a hole in your heart and you're going to be like, God, what am I going to fill that with? And then you have to like search out for the next thing. And if it's junk food, it'll fill the space like adequately. You won't be like, oh, I'm missing this thing so much. But then once that's done, that hole's going to reopen right up again and you're going to have to move on to the next thing. Or maybe you'll just rewatch Psycho-Pass because it's an amazing show with so much depth. And I'm going to talk about it sometime. I've already spoken about it twice, but I'm going to come back to it really soon. I really, episode 3 of Psycho-Pass is so interesting. I'm so excited to talk about it. But yes, like these are the kind of shows that I think are narrative junk food. And I want to state very clearly that I don't begrudge anyone for liking narrative junk food. I think like narrative junk food is important. I have watched all of the shows that I've spoken about. I think that they like fulfill important elements of basically our exploration of narrative, because we can learn how to structure things better so that they're engaging. And I think stories that do have tons of thematic depth that are not engaging are worthless. Like, why exist in the first place if you're not going to like tell a story that is engaging in some way, shape, or form? That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. Yeah, so narrative junk food is like, I wouldn't begrudge anyone for liking narrative junk food because it fulfills an important purpose. And the fact that it can be the fact that those stories are engaging, I think speaks to something that we can take and apply to stories that do have a little bit more thematic depth, to stories that like do say something that we can take with us. That's kind of it. I think I'm gonna wrap this up now. I've gotten a lot off my chest here. So I said I was going to end every one of these on a question and answering that question. So the most recent question I've been asked on Twitter was, have I seen the Haruhi disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya? I have. I think it's it is definitely one of my favorite anime films that I've ever seen. It is a phenomenal experience. I don't think Haruhi the TV series is nearly as good. Slogging through it definitely makes the movie worth it. The movie is certainly like the amazing dessert at the end of the tunnel, but like the meal isn't that great. But the movie is honestly something amazing. I do want to talk about it more fully, like give it a proper analysis. Probably several, frankly. It has several scenes that I really want to break down. Some of them I'm sure you're aware of if you've seen the film. But for right now, yes, it's a phenomenal film. If you've watched Haruhi but haven't seen the movie, please get on that. Fantastic work. And if you want to be the person to ask the question, ask one of the questions for this or a future podcast, obviously for a future podcast, you can either leave a comment on YouTube or on Patreon. depending on which is easier for you. And speaking of Miscellaneous Musings, and replay value would not be possible without the support of the following individuals: Akoha, Alejandro, Alex L., Alex Priestley, Andy Zahn, Bartos, Cameron, Daniel Kruger, Disma, Double One, Damon Play, E Laser, Ethan Bachman, Iron Phoenix Blade, Jack Israel, Martin Gonzalez, John Johning, John Noble, Joshua, Justin, Leah, Mark, Matthew, Mercurian, Philip, Ray over Fa Sharp, Richard Vargas, So Kanazawa, Cyra Leaf, Terry Fury, Ting, Unique Name, and W. Shi. And that wraps this iteration of Miscellaneous Musings, numero dos. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts on today's topic, if you enjoyed this format, the small changes we made to it. And of course, until next time,